May 10th, 1943. 11:47 in the morning. Kapitän zur See Ludwig Stummel stood in the cipher room at U-boat headquarters in Berlin, holding a message intercept that didn't make sense. Outside, through reinforced windows, spring sunlight reflected off the Landwehr Canal. Inside, the air smelled of cigarette smoke and machine oil from the Enigma devices. Stummel read the intercept again, his finger tracing each line of decoded text. Behind him, two crypt analysts waited, young men who'd been pulled from university mathematics programs, who understood probability theory better than naval tactics, who'd spent 3 years assuring everyone that Enigma was unbreakable. Everyone knew Enigma was secure. The mathematics proved it. 159 quintillion possible settings, changed daily, requiring perfect knowledge of rotor positions, ring settings, and plug board configurations to decrypt. British codebreakers would need to test every combination, a task requiring more time than the universe had existed. Impossible. That's what the experts said. That's what 3 years of successful operations had confirmed. German U-boats had sunk millions of tons of Allied shipping using Enigma encrypted communications. If the code was broken, the convoys would have evaded them. The British couldn't fake ignorance that convincingly. But Stummel was holding evidence that contradicted everything they believed. A pattern. Subtle, almost invisible, but there if you knew where to look. The British were changing convoy routes exactly 12 hours after U-boat position reports went out. Not always. That would be too obvious. But often enough. Consistently enough, in ways that suggested they weren't guessing. What happened in the next 72 hours would determine whether Germany acknowledged the truth or clung to comfortable delusions, whether intelligence officers followed evidence to its logical conclusion or rejected findings that threatened their entire operational security framework. The decision would affect every encrypted message sent for the rest of the war, every strategic plan transmitted, every life depending on communications the enemy might be reading in real time. To understand how Stummel reached this moment, you have to go back 14 months. To March 1942, when U-boat operations in the Atlantic suddenly became more difficult. Not catastrophically so. Boats were still finding convoys, still sinking ships. But the easy kills had decreased. Convoys that should have sailed into patrol lines somehow diverted around them. Merchant ships that appeared vulnerable suddenly had destroyer escorts arrive from unexpected directions. Korvettenkapitän Hans Meckel commanded U-5552, one of the most successful boats in the Atlantic Fleet. Between 1940 and early 1942, he'd sunk 30 Allied vessels. He knew how convoy operations worked, predictable routes, standard evasion tactics, British responses that followed doctrine. Then, in March 1942, something changed. "They're avoiding us," he reported to headquarters after returning from a patrol that found nothing. "Not running from us, avoiding us before we make contact, like they know where we'll be." Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, read Meckel's report with growing concern. Similar reports had come from other commanders. Convoys changing course without apparent reason. British destroyers appearing in positions that didn't match standard patrol patterns. Success rates declining month after month. Dönitz ordered an investigation. Were the British using new detection technology, better radar, improved sonar? Or, the thought barely formed before he dismissed it, had they broken Enigma? The investigation fell to Stummel, head of the U-boat Communications Security Section. He was 42, a career naval officer who'd studied cryptography before the war, who understood both the tactical necessities of secure communication and the mathematical principles underlying encryption. His job was to ensure U-boat messages couldn't be read by the enemy. For 3 years, he'd been certain of success. Now he had doubts. He began with the obvious checks. Examined Enigma machines for technical flaws. Reviewed operator procedures for security violations. tested the mathematical foundations of the encryption system. Everything checked out. The machines worked perfectly. Operators followed protocols. The mathematics remained sound, but the operational evidence kept accumulating. In April 1942, a wolf pack of 8 U-boats formed to intercept convoy HX-233. The boats were positioned perfectly based on intelligence reports. The convoy should have sailed directly into their patrol line. Instead, at the last moment, HX-233 changed course. A 40-degree deviation from its projected route made hours before German boats could have been detected by any known British technology. The convoy escaped. 8 submarines found nothing. In June 1942, U-569 transmitted its position as ordered. 12 hours later, British destroyers arrived at those exact coordinates. The U-boat escaped through luck and the commander's quick thinking. But Stummel noted the timing, noted the precision, noted that this had happened before. By July 1942, he had compiled 17 instances where British actions suggested foreknowledge of U-boat positions. 17 instances out of hundreds of patrols. Not enough to prove anything, enough to worry him. He brought his concerns to his immediate superior, Conter-Admiral Erhard Mertens, head of naval communications. They met in Martens's office, a room lined with technical manuals and security protocols, a space that represented German naval cryptography's institutional confidence. "You're suggesting the British have broken Enigma," Mertens said. "Not a question, an accusation. I'm suggesting we investigate the possibility," Stummel replied carefully. Mertens shook his head. "Impossible. We've had the best mathematicians in Germany examine the system. The number of possible combinations makes cryptanalysis impractical. Even if the British could build calculating machines, which they can't, not at the scale required, they'd need years to break a single day's settings. Then how do you explain the operational evidence? Coincidence? Lucky guesses? Perhaps they've developed better direction-finding equipment. Perhaps there are security leaks we haven't identified. Careless talk, captured documents, spies. But the machine itself, the mathematics, those are sound." Stummel wanted to argue, wanted to push harder, but Martens wasn't being unreasonable. The mathematics really were sound. Enigma really was sophisticated, and 17 suspicious instances out of hundreds of operations really could be coincidence. So Stummel returned to his desk and kept watching, kept collecting data, kept waiting for evidence strong enough to overcome institutional resistance. Meanwhile, 600 miles to the west, in a Victorian mansion called Bletchley Park, British cryptanalysts were doing exactly what German experts said was impossible. They called it Ultra. The program that broke Enigma using a combination of mathematical genius, mechanical computing, and German operational mistakes. Led by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, staffed by linguists and mathematicians and chess champions, operating 24 hours a day in conditions of absolute secrecy. They weren't reading every German message. That was still impossible. But they were reading enough. Enough to route convoys around U-boat patrol lines. Enough to direct destroyers to German submarine positions. Enough to turn the Battle of the Atlantic from a German victory into a grinding stalemate. The British were careful. They never acted on ultra-intelligence obviously enough to compromise the source. They sent reconnaissance planes to discover U-boats whose positions they already knew. They made sure some convoys still sailed into German patrol lines, maintaining the illusion that routing was based on educated guessing rather than actual intelligence. They sacrificed ships and men to protect the secret that they were reading German mail. But perfection was impossible. Some British actions were too precise, too timely, too consistent with foreknowledge. And German officers like Stummel were professional enough to notice patterns that shouldn't exist. By early 1943, the evidence had become impossible to ignore. U-boat losses were climbing. In January, 6 boats, In February, 9 boats. In March, 15 boats. Each loss represented 50 men, months of training, millions of Reichsmarks in construction costs. And increasingly, the losses suggested the British knew exactly where German submarines would be. The breaking point came in May 1943 during the battle for convoy ONS-5. A massive engagement, 43 merchant ships, escorted by British and Canadian warships, attacked by a wolf pack of 30 U-boats. The largest convoy battle of the war. It should have been a German victory. Instead, it was a catastrophe. The U-boats lost 7 boats in 3 days. 7 boats with all hands, while sinking only 13 merchant ships. The exchange ratio, the fundamental calculus that made U-boat warfare viable, had reversed. German losses now exceeded their capacity to build replacements. If this continued, the entire U-boat campaign would collapse. Dönitz called an emergency conference, May 24, 1943, at U-boat headquarters in Berlin. Present were senior commanders, technical experts, communications officers, intelligence analysts. The agenda. Why are we losing? Stummel attended. He'd spent the past 14 months compiling evidence, building charts, tracking patterns. He'd documented 43 instances where British responses suggested foreknowledge. 43 instances that couldn't be explained by coincidence or conventional intelligence methods. He'd prepared a presentation. 3 hours of analysis, showing correlations between U-boat transmissions and British actions, demonstrating that the timing was too consistent to be luck. Showing, in careful mathematical detail, that something was wrong. But before he could speak, the meeting took a different direction. They're using better radar, one commander argued. New centimeter wave sets that can detect surfaced boats at night. Improved direction finding, another suggested. Triangulation from multiple stations, giving them precise positions. Spies in France, a third proposed. Someone reporting when boats leave port. Traitors in our own ranks, someone else said darkly. Feeding information to British intelligence. Every explanation except the obvious one. Every possibility except that Enigma, the machine that secured all German military communications, not just U-boat traffic, might be compromised. Stummel listened to the theories pile up, watched senior officers grasp for explanations that didn't threaten the entire German intelligence infrastructure. He understood their resistance. Accepting that Enigma was broken meant accepting that every strategic plan transmitted, every unit position reported, every operational order sent might be known to the enemy. It meant accepting that German cryptographic superiority, a pillar of Nazi technical confidence, was an illusion. When his turn came, he stood before maps covered with markers showing U-boat losses, convoy routes, British responses. He'd rehearsed this presentation dozens of times, knew exactly how to present the evidence to be maximally convincing. "Gentlemen," he began, "I've spent 14 months investigating whether our communications are secure. I've examined technical specifications, reviewed operator procedures, analyzed operational patterns. I've looked for every explanation except the one we don't want to consider." He paused, looking at faces around the table. Some interested, some skeptical, some already hostile. "I can no longer avoid that explanation. The British are reading our messages. Not all of them, not always in real time, but frequently enough to compromise operations. The evidence is overwhelming." Silence. Complete silence. Then everyone started talking at once. "Impossible," Martins said flatly. "We've been through this. The mathematics assume the British are using conventional cryptanalysis." Stummel interrupted. "What if they're not? What if they've developed something we haven't anticipated?" "Like what?" someone demanded. "Magic. Like mechanical computing at a scale we haven't attempted. Like mathematical approaches we haven't considered. Like exploiting operator mistakes we don't realize we're making." Speculation, another officer said dismissively. You're asking us to accept that the British have achieved something our best experts say is impossible, based on patterns that could have alternative explanations. 43 instances, Stummel said, his voice rising despite his intention to stay calm. 43 times the British responded to our positions with a precision that exceeds coincidence. How many instances would convince you? 50? 100? How many men have to die before we acknowledge what the evidence shows? The meeting dissolved into argument. Technical experts defending Enigma's security, operational commanders pointing to increased British radar capability, intelligence officers suggesting spy networks and compromised documents. Everyone had an explanation that didn't require accepting the impossible. Dönitz listened to all of it. Then he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. We'll conduct a comprehensive security review, he announced, examine every aspect of our communications procedures, but unless we find definitive proof of code compromise, a captured decryption device, a confirmed enemy decrypt capability, something concrete, we continue current operations. The U-boat campaign is too critical to abandon based on speculation. It was a reasonable decision. A cautious decision. Exactly what a responsible commander should do when faced with alarming but not conclusive evidence. It was also wrong. The security review began immediately. Teams examined Enigma machines for technical vulnerabilities, interrogated operators about procedures, reviewed message logs for patterns that might aid enemy cryptanalysis, investigated possible spy networks, tested whether British direction finding was more capable than assumed. Stummel led the cryptographic analysis. He assembled a team of Germany's best mathematicians, men too valuable to risk in combat, kept in Berlin to work on code security and signals intelligence. They approached the problem methodically. Could Enigma be broken? The mathematical analysis confirmed what everyone already believed. With perfect security practices, Enigma was effectively unbreakable. The number of possible daily settings was astronomical. Even testing 1 million settings per second would require years to break a single day's key. But the analysis also revealed vulnerabilities, operator mistakes that reduced effective key space, repeated phrases that provided cribs for cryptanalysis, pattern weaknesses in how messages were structured, flaws that wouldn't matter against conventional cryptanalysis, but might matter against something more sophisticated. If the British have built machines we haven't imagined, one mathematician said carefully, if they've developed statistical methods we haven't considered, if they've found ways to exploit our procedural weaknesses, then perhaps it could be done. But we have no evidence they've done any of that, another mathematician countered. We are speculating about hypothetical capabilities based on operational patterns that might have other explanations. Stummel knew the mathematician was right. They were speculating. Everything they'd found was circumstantial, suggestive but not conclusive, not enough to justify the massive disruption that changing encryption systems would require. Meanwhile, U-boats kept dying. In June 1943, German submarines lost 24 boats, the highest monthly loss of the war. Dönitz pulled his boats back from the North Atlantic convoy routes, effectively conceding that the British had won the Battle of the Atlantic. Not because German technology was inferior. U-boats remained formidable weapons, but because operations had become unsustainable. And still, German intelligence couldn't prove Enigma was compromised. The investigation continued through summer 1943. Security procedures were tightened, new protocols implemented, operators retrained, but the fundamental question remained unanswered. Were the British reading German messages? Stummel became obsessed. He spent 18-hour days analyzing message traffic, comparing German transmissions to British actions, looking for the smoking gun that would prove his hypothesis. His wife wrote worried letters. His superiors suggested he take leave. His colleagues began avoiding him, uncomfortable with his certainty about something they couldn't prove. In August 1943, he found what he thought was proof. A U-boat had transmitted a position report using newly implemented security procedures designed to make cryptanalysis harder. The transmission went out at 14:32. At 02:17 the next morning, British destroyers arrived at those coordinates. The timing was too precise, the response too direct. There was no way the British could have located that submarine using conventional methods in 12 hours. Stummel brought the evidence to Martins immediately. This time, he thought, this time they'll have to believe. Martins examined the data, read the reports, considered the timeline. Then he shook his head. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "One instance, however suspicious, isn't proof. It could be extraordinary luck. It could be a spy at the transmission station. It could be something we haven't thought of." "How can it not be enough?" Stummel demanded. "What more do you need?" "A captured decrypt. A German message decoded by British equipment. A confirmed enemy capability, not just suspicious timing. Something that proves, beyond any doubt, that they're reading our traffic. By the time we get that kind of proof, the war might be lost." "Perhaps," Martins agreed. "But without absolute proof, we can't justify abandoning our entire communications infrastructure. Do you understand how many systems depend on Enigma? Not just U-boats, everything. Army, Luftwaffe, diplomatic corps, industrial coordination. If we declare Enigma compromised without proof, we create chaos. And if we're wrong, if there's another explanation, we've damaged our capabilities for nothing." Stummel stared at him. Understood, with sudden clarity, that this wasn't about evidence. This was about organizational inertia, about the impossibility of admitting catastrophic failure, about how institutions protect themselves from truths they can't afford to accept. "They're reading our mail," Stummel said quietly. "I know they are, and we're pretending they're not because admitting the truth is too difficult." Martins didn't argue, didn't agree, just looked at Stummel with something like pity. "Write your report," he said finally. "Document everything. If you're right, and I pray to God you're not, then future historians will need to understand what we knew and when we knew it. But I can't act on this. Not without proof that satisfies people who don't want to be satisfied." Act 4. The truth they couldn't accept. The Germans never officially acknowledged that Enigma was compromised during the war. Despite Stummel's evidence, despite mounting operational losses, despite patterns that couldn't be explained by coincidence, German intelligence clung to the belief that their codes were secure. They made modifications. Added a fourth rotor to naval Enigma in 1942, changed procedures, increased security protocols. But they never fundamentally accepted that the British were reading their most sensitive communications. Why? How could professional intelligence officers ignore evidence that seems obvious in hindsight? The answer is complicated. Part institutional inertia. Changing encryption systems during wartime would have caused massive disruption. Part mathematical confidence. The experts really did believe Enigma was unbreakable. Part psychological defense. Accepting compromise meant accepting responsibility for thousands of deaths caused by operational security failures. Part political reality. Admitting to Hitler that German communications had been compromised for years would have ended careers, possibly lives. And part genuine uncertainty. Because Stummel's evidence, however compelling, was circumstantial. The British really did have better radar. They really did have improved direction finding. They really did capture documents and run spy networks. Any individual incident could be explained by conventional intelligence methods. It was only in aggregate, looking at patterns over months, that the truth became clear. But individuals don't see aggregate patterns. They see individual events, each with plausible alternative explanations, and when the truth is unbearable, Human beings are remarkably skilled at finding alternative explanations. Stummel continued his work through 1944. He documented every suspicious incident, built statistical models, refined his analysis. His reports grew more detailed, more desperate, more certain, and more ignored. By early 1945, with Germany collapsing, it no longer mattered whether Enigma was compromised. The war was lost for reasons that transcended communications security. But Stummel knew that thousands of men had died in U-boats because their positions were known to the enemy. Knew that operations had failed because the British read German plans in advance. Knew that his warnings had been dismissed because the truth was too painful to accept. The final proof came after the war ended, when Allied intelligence agencies began declassifying information about Ultra. When German prisoners learned that the British had been reading Enigma messages since 1940. When the full scope of the compromise became undeniable. Stummel was interviewed by American intelligence officers in July 1945. They wanted to know what German intelligence had known, when they'd known it, why they hadn't acted on their suspicions. "You were right," one American officer said, reviewing Stummel's wartime reports. "Your analysis from 1943 was essentially correct. The British were reading your naval traffic, not completely but extensively. If your superiors had listened to you, if they'd changed encryption systems, it would have significantly complicated Allied operations." Stummel sat in silence for a long moment. Outside the interrogation room, Germany lay in ruins. 60 million dead. Cities destroyed. An entire civilization collapsed. And here he was, learning that his warnings had been correct and ignored. "Why didn't they listen?" the American officer asked. "Because accepting the truth meant accepting catastrophic failure," Stummel said quietly. "It meant accepting that we'd lost the Battle of the Atlantic, not because British technology was superior, but because our security was compromised. It meant accepting that thousands of men died because we didn't protect them properly. It meant accepting that German technical superiority, one of the core myths of Nazi ideology, was an illusion." He looked at the American officer. "People will believe comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, especially when the truth requires them to acknowledge their own failures. That's not unique to Germany. That's human nature. But you knew the truth. I suspected the truth. I gathered evidence supporting the truth. I reported my findings to people who didn't want to hear them. That's all intelligence officers can do. We can't make people accept what they don't want to believe." The American officer made notes, then asked, "If you could go back, what would you do differently?" Stummel thought about that question for years afterward. Thought about it while working as a telecommunications consultant in post-war Germany. Thought about it while writing his memoirs, published in 1963. Thought about it until he died in 1977, an old man haunted by the memory of warnings ignored and men drowned. "I would have been more insistent," he said finally. "I would have pushed harder. I would have found a way to make them listen. Because being right doesn't matter if you can't convince people who need convincing. And I failed at that. I gathered perfect evidence for an argument I couldn't win." In 1974, the British government officially confirmed the existence of Ultra. Declassified documents revealed the full scope of British code-breaking operations, showed how Enigma had been compromised in 1940, showed how mathematical genius and mechanical computing had achieved what German experts said was impossible, showed how carefully the British had concealed their capabilities, acting on intelligence while maintaining the illusion that German codes were secure. The revelation transformed historical understanding of the war. Battles that had seemed like British luck were revealed as British intelligence. Operations that appeared to be German mistakes were revealed as operations compromised by enemy knowledge. The entire narrative of the Atlantic campaign had to be rewritten to account for the fact that one side had been reading the other's mail for 4 years. And buried in the declassified documents was a reference to Ludwig Stummel, a footnote really barely worth mentioning. British intelligence had monitored German security investigations. They'd known that someone in U-boat headquarters suspected Enigma was compromised. They'd prepared contingency plans in case Germany changed encryption systems. But the Germans never did, never acted on their suspicions, never forced the British to find alternative intelligence sources. "We were fortunate," a British intelligence officer wrote in a post-war assessment, "that German institutional resistance to acknowledging security compromise exceeded their capacity to act on mounting evidence. Their intelligence officer, Stummel, I believe, appears to have understood the situation, but his warnings were dismissed. Had they been heeded, Allied operations would have been significantly more difficult." Stummel never knew about this document, never knew that British intelligence had recognized his analysis as accurate and worried he might convince his superiors. Never knew that his failure to persuade wasn't because his evidence was weak, but because organizational psychology worked against acknowledging catastrophic security failures. He died believing he'd failed, died knowing he'd been right but unable to convince anyone who mattered. Died thinking that if he just presented the evidence better, argued more forcefully, found more persuasive proof, he might have saved lives. But the truth was simpler and more tragic. He couldn't have succeeded. The institutional forces arrayed against acknowledging Enigma compromise were too powerful. The psychological barriers too high. The political costs too severe. No amount of evidence would have been enough because the conclusion was unbearable. Sometimes truth isn't enough. Sometimes being right doesn't matter if the people who need to hear it can't afford to believe it. That's the real story of 1943. Not just that German intelligence realized their code was broken, though Stummel and others did reach that conclusion, but that they realized it and did nothing. That they gathered evidence and filed reports and built cases and ultimately changed nothing because the truth was too terrible to accept. In the cipher room at U-boat headquarters, where Stummel first held that suspicious intercept in May 1943, Enigma machines continued chattering. Operators kept encoding messages. U-boats kept receiving orders. And British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park kept reading German mail, kept routing convoys to safety, kept directing destroyers to submarine positions. The Germans knew. Some of them, at least. The ones who were paying attention, the ones who followed evidence wherever it led. They knew their codes were broken, knew their operations were compromised, knew that men were dying because British intelligence read German transmissions. They knew, and they did nothing, because knowing isn't the same as accepting, because evidence isn't the same as action, because sometimes the truth is so painful that denial becomes the only option institutions can afford. And so the war continued. The U-boats kept sailing. The convoys kept crossing. The codes kept transmitting. And in Berlin, Ludwig Stummel kept watching, kept documenting, kept reporting to superiors who nodded and filed his reports and changed nothing. He was right. He was ignored. And thousands of men died in the water because truth alone isn't powerful enough to overcome institutional inertia, psychological denial, and the human capacity for self-deception. That's not the story they teach in military academies. It's not the story that appears in official histories. But it's the story that matters most. The story of what happens when people choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. When institutions protect themselves by refusing to acknowledge catastrophic failures. When being right isn't enough if you can't make anyone listen. In the end, that's what 1943 revealed. Not just that codes can be broken, but that truth can be known and still rejected. That evidence can accumulate and still be dismissed. That disaster can be predicted and still unfold exactly as predicted because accepting the prediction requires admitting failures too painful to acknowledge. Stummel understood this before he died, understood that his real failure wasn't gathering insufficient evidence. It was believing that evidence alone could overcome human nature, that facts could defeat denial, that truth would inevitably triumph over comfortable illusion. He learned otherwise, learned it in the cipher room in 1943. holding evidence that should have changed everything and watching it change nothing. Learned it in the interrogation room in 1945, hearing American officers confirm his analysis while Germany burned. Learned it in the quiet years afterward, watching new wars repeat old mistakes, watching people choose denial over acceptance again and again. The codes were broken. The truth was known. The evidence was clear. And none of it mattered. Not when the truth was unbearable. Not when acceptance required acknowledging responsibility for catastrophic failure. Not when human psychology and institutional inertia aligned against accepting what couldn't be denied. That's the lesson of 1943. Not about cryptography or intelligence or even warfare. About something more fundamental. About how people face truths they can't afford to believe. About how organizations protect themselves from knowledge that threatens their existence. About how evidence, however overwhelming, isn't enough when the conclusion requires accepting the unacceptable. In the spring of 1943, in a cipher room in Berlin, Ludwig Stummel held truth in his hands and watched helplessly as everyone around him chose lies instead. Because that's what people do, what institutions do, what nations do when confronted with failures too profound to acknowledge. The codes were broken, the evidence was clear, the truth was known, and it changed nothing. That's the real tragedy. Not that the secret was kept, but that it was discovered and still ignored. Not that evidence didn't exist, but that evidence didn't matter. Not that truth was hidden, but that truth was revealed and rejected. Some failures are too big to accept. Some truths are too painful to acknowledge. Some realities are too terrible to face, and so people don't face them. They file reports, they document evidence, they present findings, and they watch, powerless, as truth dissolves into denial and men keep dying for lies no one wants to stop believing.